Hi everybody, it's Sally again. Welcome to video 2 of the SK280 Silver Reed punch card series. In this video we're going to talk about what yarns these machines will knit and yarn preparation. Now, I think it is sometimes a misconception that any knitting machine can knit any weight of yarn. Well, that's not true. You have to buy a gauge of machine that is suitable for the thickness of the yarn you want to knit. So the standard gauge machines in UK terms will knit up to 4-ply. Sorry UK knitters, they do not knit double knitting. There we go. 4-ply is your go-to yarn weight, which for those of you across the Atlantic, 4-ply is like lace weight, fingering, sock yarn weight of yarns, this sort of stuff. You can knit 2-ply, 3-ply, 4-ply on here. They can obviously cope with, very fine gimp yarns. You can buy fine industrial yarns and ply them together if you so choose. There is plenty of information out on the internet about industrial weights. But as far as yarn spun for hand knitting, which can be adapted for machine knitting, you're looking at a 4-ply mostly for the standard gauge machine. If you want to knit mostly double knitting or worsted weight yarns, you'll need a mid-gauge machine. And if you want to knit thicker weight like Arons and Chunkies, you'll need a chunky machine. Now, the big disadvantage about the mid-gauge machines is there are not very many options out there. There are no new punch card versions of a mid-gauge machine. Tends to be the basic plastic one where you have to do all the stitch pattern manipulation by hand. Or you can go up to a chunky one, which will knit double knitting, but then the downside is it doesn't have very many needles, 110 or so. So, if you want to knit big things, you're not going to be able to, not in one piece anyway. So it's horses for courses. You've got to buy a yarn that's suitable for your machine. Now, the other thing is you cannot knit directly from a ball of wool like this. It has to be rewound. Now, as an interest in terminology, I'm quite keen to know if we call these things all the same thing. Now, to me, this is a skein or a hank. That's a ball. That's the same thing wound into a cake. And this is a cone. So that's what I call them, just so that you know. By all means, you can use hand knitting yarns, but they have to be rewound. And for that, you'll need, let me just reach for it, you'll need some kind of a yarn winder. I have this meaty big contraption, which will wind up to about 400 grams. It has detachable hats that come off the middle of it. So, and it's just a jumbo yarn winder. You can buy smaller ones that'll wind one ball, that did that one. But you must rewind hand knitting yarn. You can't knit directly from the ball. The machine goes too fast for this to pull off the ball quick enough. And if you try to knit from a ball, it will just muck up your tension and it will show. It will stick out like a sore thumb on your knitting. So don't do it. It's not worth it, is my advice. That's got that out of the way. If you're buying your hand knitting yarn and rewinding it, you might need to wax it, because these are prepped up for use straight onto the knitting machine, whereas these obviously aren't. I tend to find that 99% of the time I don't need to wax the yarn. Let me just get something. Oops. Oh, good, it hasn't stopped. Sorry about that. I dropped it on the floor. So yes, waxing yarn. Most of the time I don't need to wax my yarns. But if I do, I've actually found that this stuff is really good. rather than faffing about trying to wind it round candles and I don't know what else. I just happened to be sitting in my bedroom one day when I spotted this pot of styling wax and I thought, ooh, I'll try that, and it worked an absolute treat. So this is unperfumed and it looks like Vaseline on the inside. So I just put a little bit on my hand, which the yarn runs through as I'm winding it onto the winder, and then of course, you know, this is designed to be washed out, so it will wash out first time you wash it. So that's my little tip for what to do if you need to wax yarns. Use hairstyling wax. Obviously you don't want something that's glittery and very highly scented, but this is just basic VO5 hairstyling wax. So that's yarn preparation. And the other thing you're going to need is waste yarn. Now, waste yarn for a hand knitter can be a bit of a weird concept, or a non-knitter can be a bit, what do you want waste yarn for? Well, waste yarn in sort of like hand knitting terminology is like the equivalent of taking it off on a holding pin. Instead of putting it on a holding pin, you take your knitting off on waste yarn. So you just switch to a different yarn with a highly contrasting colour usually, so you can see the delineation between your main knitting and your waste knitting. 10 or 12 rows of waste yarn and drop it off the machine. Then you can just pick the stitches up again afterwards to rehang the work. You might use it at the beginning of some pieces of work if you're going to create a hem, because you'll have an open edge between the waste yarn and the main yarn, which you can pick up to create a turned up hem. And waste yarn is just useful for all sorts of purposes. And so I advise people when they buy a new knitting machine to invest in a couple of cones of something decent. Not wool or anything expensive, but just a decent acrylic. In the UK, I buy these yarn to cone, which come from Woolly Knit. A really, really nice yarn. Yeoman's do a nice acrylic that isn't overly expensive either. Or you could buy a couple of balls of a cheapy 4-ply from your local market or yarn shop and rewind them and use. Then you can use them for practicing, because as I said in the first video, you're going to have to practice a lot. And then if you want to, you can unravel it, rewind it and reuse it for waste yarn. But you know, I have all this is like a scrappy bit of old bits of white stuff that I've rewound to use for my waste yarn. And I had this manky old cone that's all faded on the top. I don't know if you can see that I use if I need a dark contrast. Choose something that's smooth. You don't want anything that's fluffy or fibrous for your waste yarn, because you don't want to be picking bits out of your knitting afterwards where it's left a nice trace of all sorts of different fibres. So you know, spending 25 pounds on a couple of cones of yarn is all part of the investment. You need to do it to learn to machine knit. That's another thing that beginners do. They root around and find some crappy old bit of dried up yarn in some utterly unsuitable fibre and think they're going to learn to machine knit with it. No, no, no. Use something decent. And make sure as well that you use something like an acrylic that's got a little bit of stretch to it. Trying to machine knit with yarns like cotton or linen that have no stretch at all is not easy. And if you try to learn with yarns like that, it's just making your learning journey harder than it needs to be. So again, my advice is to get a couple of cones of cheap acrylic, and then you can, you know, practice knitting up little kids' garments or something like that as your practice pieces. And if you haven't got kids, then I'm sure you know someone who has, who would probably like some free jumpers, so or give them to a charity shop. Invest in some decent acrylic practice / waste yarn. The other thing I just wanted to talk about on this video before I move on to actually knitting in the next one, it'll probably take me long enough. Can hear you saying, get on with it, just start knitting, is your toolbox. Now, for reasons best known to them, they these days are incredibly stingy with these machines, and they only give you 2 of these. These are claw weights. 2 is not enough. I usually have at least 5, possibly 7, or even 9 or 11 across my work, depending on how big the piece of knitting is. If I'm knitting right the way across the bed, it could be 11 weights. And I prefer to use the claw weights because they're small and can be positioned exactly where you want them to be, exactly where you want that weight to be. So buy more weights. And then you need to make sure you've got scissors with you, a notebook and pencil. Oh, there's my pencil. I haven't got my notebook. Notebook's down there. The other thing that's useful to do is to get an old store card or whatever kind of card it might be, and cut it in half diagonally like that, because these are very useful to run along as latch openers if you need to make sure your latches are open for whatever reason. I usually have a couple of clothes pegs knocking about, and a nice big selection of ravel cord. I would not be without ravel cord. It's the most essential item in my kit. So, there we go. And just lots of little nail files I keep here, because there's nothing more aggravating than getting a snagged nail that keeps catching on your knitting. Then obviously your pushers and your transfer tools all up the back here. If you can get your hands on one of these, you don't need it to begin with, but they're a nice little accessory to have. It's a 7-prong adjustable transfer tool, and you can put the prongs out in whatever combination you want to use as making like interesting transfers. They do come up for sale second hand occasionally. They don't make them new anymore, but if you see one, I use mine quite a bit. Other than that, I keep a piece of an old stocking here, which you might think, what on earth do you do with that? But it's quite useful to put over your sinker post to stop the brushes rubbing if you've got a piece of work in hold. And then I've got my spare brushes and bits and pieces. I keep knitting pins up here and safety pins in case I need to catch a drop stitch, and a bodkin if I need that. So they are in my little toolbox as well. Now ravel cord, I just need to move you again over here. What have I done with it? From that wonderful online store Amazon, you can buy spools of this stuff, which is variously called kumihimo thread, Chinese knotting thread, braiding thread, beading thread, all sorts of things. But it is 0.8mm rat tail was the other wonderful name for it. And this makes wonderful ravel cord. It's a teeny bit thicker than the ravel cord you get supplied with your knitting machine, but it does the job just as well. And there's like 100 meters on this spool, so it's going to last me till I die. So there we go. And I don't know how much it was, £10 maybe, something like that. It comes in a lovely nice range of colours too. A bright green one somewhere. Useful to have. Other than that, I don't think there's anything else I have in here that could be deemed to be a useful extra, but these are the things that I have, or that I keep around all the time. When you get around to using a ribber, bulldog clips are very handy things. These things are holding your ribber comb in place, so that's my little extra knickknacks. And then there's this thing. I think they just call it a yarn holder. I call it my twiddle stick. It's like a a wooden spike that sits on a pole, and you can put your ball of wound yarn on it, and it will spin round and make it easier to unwind. That's another useful little gadget I've got. Right, so that's the useful gadgets list over. Yeah, I did mention about notebook, keeping notes. Also, obviously, if you've got a smartphone or an iPad or something, filming things and taking photographs is useful, especially if you've got like fancy needle arrangements or what have you. They're very useful to keep a record of what you're doing as well. I think that's about it. Let's get knitting. So, in the first video I'm going to do, I'll be doing open cast on. Again, to the newbie knitter, you think, well, what's the point of an open cast on? Why wouldn't you want to secure the stitches? Well, you don't always need to secure them if you're just doing a tension piece or a bit of practice knitting or something like that. And the advantage of it is it's quick. So that's why we have open cast on. But anyway, I will go through all of those in the next videos.